What's up, guys? Ming the Merciless 93 here, and we are back in our second part of the gold coin cash game action to unlock all these funky ass tournaments they have for us in the challenge section. We were kind of discussing in the last video ways to spend our time efficiently, and then we were starting to talk about a little bit of strategy content related to combinatorics and other random things, balance, exploitation, all that. Well, I'm sure we'll get into more of that. We're going to raise here with the ace-9 of hearts under the gun. Generally want to play all of the pocket pairs and suited aces, though you can lob off some of the worst pocket pairs because they're the ones that get overset the most, and they don't really show down that well. They have the least amount of equity. They have the worst time out of position, just because they suck on every board texture that you don't hit a set. And when you do hit a set, well, they're going to be overset the most. So they are the least valuable hands, and in tougher games especially, there's not much of a reason to be raising them. If you have guys that are just never calling and they're just super nitty, then you can certainly expand to those in spots where you get to over c-bet successfully anyway. And as we see this board texture, we're in a four-way pot and we don't have any equity going forward. This makes it super easy on us. But yeah, we were talking about in the last video bet sizing and how big bets often let your opponent play perfectly. Now, don't get me wrong. The stronger your opponent's calling range can be, the stronger your bet can be because that calling range is going to be further inelastic to that sizing. The stronger they have as far as hand range goes, then the more likely they are going to be willing to call a big bet. I mean, that makes sense. Then from there, it just kind of depends on the opponent. Some of your opponents will be very willing to call a weak bet with nothing or a very big bet with nothing. So there is a lot to be said for paying attention to the individual. Here we have 2-6 offsuit, and we are just going to check, folding our Queen 5 offsuit. We flop the absolute nothing, so we're just going to fold to this 2K lead. But let's see what John Henry shows up with. Generally, when he bets 2K, he's not going to always have a draw. He might have some sort of a gut shot that wants a free card like King 10 or King Jack, but a lot of the times it's just a made hand, and he has a hand like 4X or 9X. He might have a queen and not know how to bet it. He bets a 6 on the turn, which we know doesn't really help because we have a 6. So it's not like he's going to make two pair there that often. He bombs the turn and then checks the river. This is kind of a nonsensical. He might have a hand like King 10 or something. There's the King 4. Like I said, you know, he does on the flop sizing does relate to him having a 4 or a 9, but then the turn pot, so weird. And honestly, that's the mindset of a casual player. We'll go ahead and limp the King 5 offsuit here in the small blind, getting a gazillion to 1. It's not amazing, but it is, you know, it is King 5, and it's all right. It's all right. Definitely prefer to be suited or have some sort of playability, but, you know. And we're just going to be checking and folding in most cases. And over here, we just have a bluff catcher in a spot where there aren't a lot of deuces. I think that this is actually a spot where we can make one of these 2K bets just because of the board texture. They can have 3s up, and they can also call here with hands like King Queen or Ace X. So we actually get quite a bit of value. And as you can see, we bet and everyone folds. And part of why we can bet that price is Annie's stack size is only 16K in the 8K pot, and you know people are just going to dick around a little bit less in that scenario if they're paying attention. Don't get me wrong; they don't have to necessarily be paying attention, but if they are, then they're going to be less likely to monkey around, and it makes our play easier on future streets as well. In general, we manage the pot pretty well, and if we ever happen to win the pot, well, golly gee, that's perfect. We're going to put this in the old check fold range. Not going to do much here with our ace of diamonds and a 4 of hearts. Way too many hands interact with this board, out of position, 3 other players. Now we have to assume that the 5 of hearts is not going to be a card that we want to call here with. If this went call again and we had the King of Spades, we would clearly just call. But this is a spot where we're just gone. Should be pretty clear. And Henry potted it last time when he had just a pair. Very weak hand. But it wasn't over raises. It wasn't over bets. So I'm not entirely sure. He could have easily just had a flush there. And what would the bottom of his value betting range be? I mean, maybe that. Maybe just a flush or nothing. A flush or a turn set in some weird, bizarro world. You know, some strange, bizarro Superman world. I don't know, man. We're just going to fold here because the path to showdown is a difficult one. If we call here, let's say we have the best hand against King Queen, we're going to lose on a 9, a 7, a King, a Queen. There's so many cards that they can end up betting in position. And even an ace isn't amazing because king-queen roasts us. So we're pretty much out of position, and we have no path to showdown. You have to consider what your path to showdown is. You also have to consider your relative showdown strength. I think this is something that people don't really talk about. That it's a term that I've coined myself, I believe, and that is relative showdown value versus absolute showdown value. And I think this relates to when you should be turning a hand into a bluff and when you shouldn't. So let's say you have a pair of deuces in a spot where your opponent is a passive player, and if he doesn't hit his ace with like ace-jack or ace-queen or ace-king, he just checks them down all the way, and he doesn't stab anywhere unless he hits top pair. You know, if the turn is a queen and he has ace-jack, he's just going to check down ace-jack. He's not going to start repping the queen and double barreling, anything like that. Against that guy, you could check your deuces down because you have decent showdown value because he's showing down a fuck ton of ace-high combos. Now let's say that the board is king, 7, 8, and you have pocket fives. If you check down pocket fives on king, 7, 8 against an opponent's check, check, check range, chances are, even though you're beating his ace-highs, he's very capable of having 7x or 8x or pocket sixes. Those are all combos that are going to beat you, and in some world, 9s or 10s or jacks, any of that type of stuff. So that is a spot where you would be better served, especially if you have position, to use the board texture to try to get your opponent to fold one of those slightly better hands once he's shown that he doesn't have a lot of kings in his checking range. That's sort of how it boils down. Is my opponent the type of player that slow plays or balances? And if you think he's just straightforward, if he has a king, he mostly bets. And if he has a second pair hand or an ace-high hand or a give-up, he just mostly checks and then tries to get the showdown. You don't want to give him an easy path to showdown. Because if I have pocket fives in that spot, I can get my opponent to fold 6s, 7x, 8x, pocket 9s, pocket 10s. You have to look at the disparity combinatorially between what's going to call you on one street and what's going to call you on a later street. So if the board texture is such and the ranges are such that when he checks, he's not really going to have a lot of draws. I mean, again, a balanced player will occasionally have like a pair flush draw on some boards and, you know, nut flush draw on other boards. So, you know, against balanced players, you're going to have to be more careful. But, and I'm going to fold here, even though there's a limper, just because Danny's crazy. And, you know, we're still in a bit of an early position to be playing Jack 9 offsuit, even though there is a limper there and it is attackable. So, yeah, when you're looking at that spot, you say, if he's just basically never going to have a draw, then all the draws are going to favor me, betting in position especially. And you can look at it from a broad perspective of how many combos are going to call me on one street versus how many combos are going to call me on the final street. So, in a sense, you can say versus a checking range on the flop on king, 7, 8 rainbow that doesn't include any king X combos. It doesn't include pocket 7s, pocket 8s, pocket aces. That's a spot where you can probably triple barrel almost every time. Because if he never has top pair or better, then he only has second pair or worse, which means that his calling range is going to be incrementally decreased as we bet on turns and rivers. Now, of course, you know, there are going to be turns and rivers that improve his hands sometimes. So, for instance, he might check call the flop with 8-9, and then the turn is a 9. And that kind of sucks. And also pocket 9s gets there. So I'm not saying that you're going to have absolute success every time this happens, but for instance, if the turn is a deuce and the river is a 3, those are cards that are relatively insignificant to a flop calling range as far as the improvement, the betterment of that range. So if your opponent's not the type of guy to check call king 10, then you could probably triple barrel against his checking range because his flop calling range should contain a 7, an 8, maybe pocket 6s in a pinch. Some people do call those, but a lot of the times it's more on paired boards. And then whatever middling pairs he has could be queens, jacks, 10s, and 9s. So depending on how many combos of those hands he's going to have, you can start to fire and assume that portion of those, let's say he's got 100% of his range is second pair or air. And then when you bet, 80% of his range ends up calling because it's one pair, and then he folds all the air that he didn't see bet, which is oftentimes going to be ace high, whatever. And then on the turn, you bet again. So now he has 80% of what he called the flop with. Let's say he folds 60% of that. So you're getting a fold on the turn at a relatively high frequency as well, and he's only calling with some of the better end of the hands that he has. So now you're looking at maybe queens, jacks, anything that's picked up some additional equity on the turn. Like, let's say the turn, and forget the fact that you have pocket 5s here for a minute and just go with it with me. Let's say he calls a flop with pocket 6s, pocket 9s, and now the turn is a 5. So on that 5, pocket 6s now has an open-ended straight draw, so it's going to call the turn, and pocket 9s now has a gut shot and still overs, you know, the second or third pair. So it's probably going to be more likely to call a turn bet. But those are combos that are going to go in the turn calling range that are also going to very frequently be on a blank river folding range. So when you look at the broad spectrum of how many combos call the flop versus how many combos are going to fold by the river, and you think about that versus an unprotected range, you just get to barrel at a really high frequency and exploit the fact that they're not protecting their checking range and they're not defending enough of their range that is checking. That's why you have to have checking combos that do have the ability to defend over multiple streets, because otherwise you end up having too many folds on the river. And that's something that manifests itself live as well, which is why when you're continuation betting in live poker, let's say the flop is 10-3-2 and I have king queen with a backdoor flush draw. That's a spot where if I'm in a 4-way pot, I'm not super excited about betting if my opponents are particularly stationy, but if I'm in a 3-way pot or I'm in a 4-way pot with relatively straightforward players, I mean, I have 2 overcards to a 10, even though it's sometimes dominated, and sometimes they have deuces or 3s or 10-3 suited. A lot of the time, they're just going to have ace high. At best, they're going to have some sort of a 10, and they play all kinds of kickers, so they're going to have like 10-6, and then they're just going to have 4-5 and 5-6 and ace-4 and ace-5, and they're just going to have so many random, just low equity, not very strong hands. There's very few strong hands, especially if they would be 3-betting 10s, which is not something that always happens. Players don't really 3-bet as much as they should live, so you're going to see more of an abundance of middling sets on 10-high and jack-high boards because they just tend to flat those, and that is relatively correct depending on the pre-flop action. For instance, if the cutoff raises and I have the button and I have pocket 10, so I'm going to 3-bet him. But if it goes middle position raises to 15 and 2 people call, you know, 3x raise at 2-5, and I'm just going to call on the button because my hand as pocket 10s is now much closer to being pocket 6s or pocket 7s than it is to being pocket kings. And I think that people sometimes overdo the value of those pairs. Like, yes, you'd like to get it heads up, but honestly, would I rather put myself in a spot where I make it 75 on the button, and then I get like 3 callers, it's a $300 pot, and I have no ability to get fold equity post-flop? You're basically just building a pot before you've hit a set. And that's not really something you want to do unless you're absolutely certain that you're getting fold equity. If you're certain that you can get it heads up against one dude that's got a relatively loose range, then maybe you want to do that. But a lot of the time, that's not the case. So you have to kind of be aware that there are going to be hands that you can play multiple ways, but the best way to play them in this exact scenario is not necessarily going to be the same as with slightly different variables. What the hell do we have going on over here anyway? We have our 6-8, which we got rid of. We wouldn't even really call there with a backdoor flush draw just because of the fact that there's still going to be, like, if we hit a 6, we could still be losing to 10s, aces, ace-6. Same thing with an 8. Like, our draw's dominated. 8 puts up some straights and whatnot. So our outs aren't good. We don't have a backdoor flush draw. Not a very good spot for us for the most part, so we're just going to pass on it. And we are going to raise it up with our jack-9 offsuit here if it does fold to us. And we'll also isolate her if it doesn't. I'm just going with a pot size raise over Danny here. Even though it is a little bit on the risky side, Danny hasn't been going too crazy lately. And we have a check back combination here. This is just second pair. It is a c-bettable board. When he leads and he calls, it's hard to believe that anybody actually has an ace in this spot. But at the same time, the hands that they're going to be leading might play favorably if they have something like Queen Jack, and it's going to put us in a pretty tough spot. So we're just going to call and see a blank turn card. And that's obviously not a blank turn card. Maybe he's got a flush draw. Maybe he's got a better jack. Maybe he's got ace deuce. And I think we could just easily get away from it on this card and just sort of see what they show up with and make a note of that for the future. But yeah, and he's just all in, and it'll be funny if Danny actually folds the river here because Danny doesn't seem to be doing much by way of folding, and he does end up folding the river. So you could see that, you know, Danny's going to call versus a very small flop bet. Danny's calling versus a pot-sized turn bet. Danny has the capability of folding to an all-in shove on the river, a bit of an overbet. So there's, you know, if you're going to get fold equity against players, in some cases you're just going to get it on the river. And, you know, like, let's say live, I raise it up, I get 3 callers, and the flop is 3-7-3, and I c-bet with a backdoor nut flush draw and some of their gut shot blockers, like ace-4, for instance. and I get one caller from an old dude. He probably has a 7 more often than he has a 3. He probably has some of the offsuit bluff combos. And there's all kinds of dumb shit this guy can have. We're just going to make this fold with ace-queen, even though we sometimes fold the best hand. We get a coin flip out of that dude. You can't really expect him to have too much of a bluffing frequency. And ace-4 just, yeah, not really sure what that's all about. But nonetheless, we played our hand the correct way. You shouldn't really expect a rando person to just isolate with the ace-4 there. But this is the gold coin special. So that is slightly different. So yeah, so if I see a 10 on the turn, I have to assume that if I bet the turn and bet the river, old guy is folding everything that isn't 10-7 or 10-3 or 3x by the river. Because even the players in those games realize, hey, I can't be calling with just like, you know, king 7 on a 10 high board when it goes bet on the turn in the river. Like, you have more fold equity in live games than you think. You just have to pick your spots. You just have to be selective with your scenarios that you're picking, because you definitely have less fold equity than you think in some spots and more fold equity than you think in others. So I think that it's really important not to over c-bet unless you're heads up. If you're heads up or occasionally three-way with some backdoor equity, I'm fine c-betting like a maniac, because they will play straightforwardly, especially if you sort of have a savage table image where you win most of the pots you play and nobody really wants to dick around with you. That ends up being a benefit as well. And we're just going to go ahead and fold the 2-6, limp it in with the king 9. We have a gut shot, but we don't have a backdoor flush draw. Our outs are relatively tainted. Our king is dominated 7 ways from Sunday. So this is the spot where we're just going to check and fold. And this is why equity denial bets work, because if you look at this board, I don't really want to lead here four-handed. And now when I'm faced with this position, like this spot, I can't even really call. I have a gut shot, but my outs aren't clean, and my king isn't necessarily ever good. It just ends up being like a reverse implied odds spot. So, you know, the equity denial actually works. Whereas if they checked, we got a free card. We get a free card to see the outs that are good. Like maybe we hit a king and maybe, you know, we get to showdown the portion of the time that's good. Maybe we see the 10, and even though the diamond sucks, maybe we still have the best hand there, a decent amount, because somebody's, you know, oftentimes going to bet a flush draw. So that is why small equity denial bets work in spots, because of that exact spot, that exact reason. Because even with hands that want to call, you're often just dominated and you can't. That doesn't mean that players aren't going to call in spots where they shouldn't. They're definitely going to have poor ranges in certain scenarios. You just have to identify, okay, I'm betting here, this sizing, as an equity denial bet, and my opponent is responding by one end of an extreme versus another. I can say that my opponent is going to fold every time. So then I can continue to do that and shift my range when I have better hands to either making bigger bets or checking more. And then, you know, if he's never, ever folding versus always folding, then, you know, you make the opposite adjustment. So, and if he's got somewhere in the middle, then you just stay relatively balanced yourself. We're checking this down because this is a board texture where he has an abundance of calling combos that are also going to potentially bluff rivers. Like, we don't want a triple barrel with ace deuce there, and we don't want a double barrel, even though the flop you're betting is kind of like a value bet against hands like 8-9 and jack-9 and 5-6. I mean, there's abundance of straight draws, so our fold equity is low, but at the same time, if we get called, we don't really want to barrel this exact combo. We don't have a backdoor flush draw, and then, you know, if we have to check back the turn, and we're just going to fold way too much to draws on the river, because this is not a combo that's going to want to bluff catch a river. It's not a combo that's going to want to double or triple barrel, and it's a board texture where we have very low fold equity. So all of those variables add up to, let's just check our ace high down and see if we can get the showdown against Cat Chick. Cat Chick's probably kind of frumpy, might be a bit old, might have a flower in her hair, not sure. I mean, a self-proclaimed Cat Chick is kind of wearing the badge of, I'm not with anyone. I'm single. I'm old. I'm just, you know what I mean? Like, that. If you label yourself Cat Chick like that, chances are you're not an attractive gym bunny. Otherwise, your name would be like Barbarella 675 or something. You know, Barbellarella. Hey, we're gonna fold the 2-6 offsuit. Guys, I'm just jive talking. I'm honestly, we're just that's just a little jive talk on my part, a little trickery, a little chicanery. No worries. I'm gonna fold this 8 deuce. Suited? It is suited. This is funny. Hope you guys are enjoying this. I'm having a good time. So much out there in the world. So much knowledge out there. Knowledge is amazing. Soak up all the knowledge. Learn, learn, learn. Not the preferred nomenclature. I just love poker's game theory. Just putting it into practice. Live poker is so much fun. But I'm having a very good time doing that. Moving to Vegas a month ago. Just life's a blast, man. And hopefully not a nuclear blast by these morons we have in our political positions. All right, we're going to go ahead and raise it up here. It looks like we were playing some heads up against Danny. Might get a little more action for the last few minutes of the video. He's going to 3-bet, and we are going to flat call. We are not going to fold heads up. However, we are going to have to surrender the pot on this board texture, as it will hit a variety of combos that he would have and not do much for us. There is a world where we could just 4-bet and shovel it in, but that's a bit overzealous for the most part. And we're going to fold 5 deuce offsuit. And we're going to raise it up with our 5-4. And this is a board where we can start to bet and probably end up triple barreling. But again, Danny does check raise a lot. We're looking for a club on the turn. That 7 is not a good card for us. So we are just going to give up completely. And if it was a club on the turn, then we probably would have just triple barreled off. This is not a good spot. We're just going to have to surrender this pot. If we bluff here, we're basically just trying to bluffing him off of a 9. And I think he's just going to call with a lot of his hands. We have 5 high, I know, but I don't think Danny's the type of guy that's going to be folding. Unfortunately, we get roasted. That's one combo that's going to beat us. I wouldn't expect Danny to be floating with 8 high on the flop. Let's just say that. And like in a non-gold coin world, we shouldn't really have that much fold equity in that spot because he can still have flushes and he can have 10 jack, and we don't have flushes that much, and we don't have 10 jack, and he can sometimes hit 2 pair with the king. So theoretically, it's not a very good spot. And you know, unfortunately, against Danny, it would have been a good spot. That's funny. All right, we're going to take a check line here in our limp pot, going for 2 streets of value or bluff catching until it seems like a bad idea. We will continuation bet over here against the cat chick, the self-proclaimed cat chick. That turn card is not amazing for us with the ace-4 just because 8-10 gets there if they are betting jack-9, which isn't super likely. So, you know, it's good other than the 8-10 thing. We're still going to have to call. This is a play money game, for God's sakes. And we're going to go ahead and value bet here. That should slow them down. Like, that 9 should scare them. And it doesn't. Okay, so their value range here is basically hands that beat us. It's 8-10, it's 9x, it's pocket 7s, it's bigger aces. We chop with ace-10. They could still have ace-queen. I think we just have a fold here, unfortunately. And I think versus the cat chick, we're just going to value bet. You can look at that spot and just kind of sum it up like, okay, what's their value range? Their value range is definitely crushing us. And we can have a 9, and they're just betting pot into a spot where we can have a 9. They just don't care. That's another indicator that our hand isn't good. And some players will overplay hands, for sure. Like, they'll overplay having an ace in that spot, and they'll just be betting with, like, ace-6 or something, or some weirdo, like, one pair, no kicker type thing. But that's not going to happen too frequently. And, you know, all the clues are there. If they have a value hand, we're way behind, and now we're relying on bluffs. I don't think they're going to have that many bluffs. Basically, you just have to bet with a hand that had a backdoor draw of some sort, and then bet an 8x or a 10x, just triple barrel, pot all, crazy willy-nilly style. It's possible, it's just not likely. And it looks like we are getting boned on this table, so we will see. Oh, man. What is this table? All right, we'll just go ahead and call their ace-king here. Guys, we're going to play even higher stakes. We're going to play even higher stakes. We are going to buy in. There we go. Yeah. These are the highest stakes ever. Look at this, guys. We got 4.6 million. That's like all of our gold coins. We have our bankroll on the table, ladies and gentlemen. We are playing 25,000, 50,000. And now we can fold our ace king on this turn. Oh man, we might not even make it to the end of the video. We got 5 minutes left to go here, ladies and gentlemen. We might not make it. Might bust our roll. I could have bought a damn avatar, for God's sake. It's ridiculous. I'm going to fold this 3-7. All right, we've got ace-7 in the big blind. What are we working with? Come on, give me something delicious. King-10 of hearts, that is delicious. We are going to isolate. All right, we get called. We have a backdoor, flush draw, straight draw, 2 overs, and we have good blockers to hands like 10-Jack and 10-8. We're going to go ahead and just fire half pot lazily here. And we're going to call the min raise in the big blind with our ace-7 offsuit. We're going to check fold this board. We now have a gut shot, but that's one of the worst spots for us because there's lack of fold equity. 4-5 gets there, 8-10 gets there, and we just have to check back and hope that we hit a card that improves our hand. And we're not always going to improve like a 10 or a 10. That's obviously not a great card, and neither is a king because we can still be beat a ton of ways here. So we just have to check back and give up. Whenever you do turn equity in a spot where you had a backdoor draw, some of the combos that you could hit or some of the cards that you could hit are not necessarily going to increase your fold equity. And if it's not a good card to increase your fold equity, then you have to just be checking back, taking your equity, and playing a river. That doesn't mean that you're going to lose the hand 100% of the time. It just means that functionally, you have to ask yourself, do I want to double barrel this board with this combo right now? Probably not. You know, unless you have a pretty good read that this guy's capable of folding somewhere with hands that are definitely going to call the turn. So if you estimate that you just don't have that fold equity, you should be taking your equity and then playing a river. Just keep in mind what other combos that you would check back there and, you know, quote unquote, take your equity. You know, other combos are going to be made hands that don't necessarily have a big kicker or aren't strong enough to value bet, or maybe the turn card really smacks your opponent's range and you have to check back a hand like pocket queens. Or against passive players, obviously you would just bet fold the majority of the time. But yeah, you have to consider what else you'd have in your range, because a lot of the times people have a very exploitable bet check range in a sense that they over c-bet, or they bet because something looks good to start with their, you know, for their hand, backdoor draws, whatever, and then they get to the turn and then they're just like, oh, well, I got to check because that card sucks, but they don't check enough as far as combos go to be able to interact well on rivers, which leaves them with a very exposed river range versus bets. How many times have you guys been in the spot where you bet the flop, check the turn, your opponent like bombs the river, you know, 3/4 or bigger, and you just have no idea what to do with a marginal hand? And the reason why is that you're always in that spot with a marginal hand. You either have the draw that got lucky and hit that's easy to play because you have either an easy call or raise, or you have some sort of a marginal hand that doesn't want to show down. And the reason why you're always in a tough spot in those scenarios is because you don't have enough checking hands that are somewhat strong. So if the board was such that your hand was invulnerable and it was better for your opponent's range, and you happen to have something that was kind of on the sneaky side of things, like if we had 8-10 on that board and there's no flush draw out there, and our opponent can value bet sets on the river, and our opponent can bluff on the river. Let's say our opponent is capable of floating with ace-jack and then turning ace-jack into a bluff on the river, a more sophisticated opponent, the light saber of opponents, so to speak. That's a guy you might want to check back the nut straight on, or some other sort of, on a dry board texture, a hand that's relatively invulnerable. And yeah, you're going to get beat sometimes when the river is a paired card and they, you know, bomb it and you have to call and they have the boat. But that's not often going to happen, first of all. Second of all, those are spots where you end up maximizing against a lot of combos, because if they bet the river and then they can't figure out what you have, it doesn't make sense to them. They might pay off a bit more often with some of the hands that are middling or upper parts of their range. And, you know, the main thing to think about is my hand invulnerable in this spot? If it's a real dicey board where it's like, you know, two flush out there, or like two tone, you know, there's like 2 flush draws and a 3 straight, and you think your opponent has an overpair or top pair, then don't do that. Definitely bet. But if it's a spot where, you started, you have a range of hands that could have good double barreling combos on the flop, and then you get a really bad card for it because it really smacks your opponent's range, consider slow playing some of the invulnerable hands for you in that spot. Oh man, we've won 42,000. I think we're going to stop here, guys. I think we are done with this video. That's another 30 minutes. We are going to turn this one off and come back to you with some low-stakes cash games. And we'll continue to talk about more strategy in detail there. I am Ming the Merciless 93. You can catch me on Twitter at EmperorMing93 or on twitch.tv/Ming the Merciless 93. I do poker coaching on there with cash game students, tournament students. We talk about all kinds of things related to game theory, combinatorics, all that kind of jive, balance, exploitation, whatever else, and a few dick jokes as well. You guys have a good one, and I'll catch you on the flip side.